Welcome to Squirrel Marketing Podcast. This is Bill Bronson, marketing guru, and I've got Jeffrey the Cooperstein.
The Coopster.
The
Okay.
Coopster, I added that. Sports podcast legend, and we're coming to you live here from Empower Brokerage.
Yes.
It is an insurance, health insurance, life insurance, annuities brokerage. And the cool thing about Empower Brokerage is that they can search the country for the best prices, and they're not tied to one carrier. So it's pretty cool. Yeah. EmpowerBrokerage.com if you want to check them out, get a quote.
See our fine work.
See the fine work. Yeah, there are a lot of hardworking people here. So, but today we're going to talk about Harley Davidson. And I was thinking, Jeffrey, we would start doing some maybe case studies about different companies and take a look at history, take a look at what's happened.
Yeah.
So that we can learn from it.
Yeah, exactly. And, with big companies like Harley and, there are so many different case studies that we can look at to try to learn from and try to take things from and implement that into our strategy, into your strategy. So, no, it'll definitely be fun. I'm not a huge motorcycle guy, but I know Harley is one of the most recognizable brands in the world. So,
yeah, absolutely. It's got a rich history, and we'll talk about some of that. It's very interesting. And then one of the things that we'll do after a while, I'm not sure if we'll do it next or if we'll do it after a few different companies, but we'll take a look at something called, and you can Google this before you listen to the podcast, but it's called Porter's 5 Forces That Shape Strategy. So Porter's 5 competitive forces that shape strategy. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at these company case studies. We'll talk about them, and then we'll take that and make sense of it along the way, as well as afterwards. We'll really dig deep into Porter's 5 forces theory and how you can take your company or your endeavor and really create a good competitive strategy so you can move forward and compete. So, all right, let's dig into it. So Harley Davidson, little history. Most of you know Harley Davidson is an American icon. Cool fact is they're one of two American motorcycle companies that survived the Great Depression.
interesting. Didn't know that.
And oddly enough, both these companies kind of started in the same area. So Milwaukee, and it's Indian and Harley. And when do you think Harley Davidson started business? When do you think they made their first motorcycle?
I know it was early. It had, around 1910?
Close. Yeah, you're close. 1901 is when a 20-year-old named William Harley and his childhood friend named Arthur Davidson, they didn't spend their time video gaming because they didn't have any video games.
Yeah, they didn't have those back then.
They spent their time in the garage making stuff. And in fact, one of them worked at a machine shop, and I guess in Milwaukee that was a big thing, steel
Industrial,
foundry and a tool and die company and these kinds of things. A lot of steel working going on, a lot of factory stuff. But man, just the innovative thought. These guys, there were a lot of hills, I guess, in Milwaukee, but I guess the hills prompted them to get sick of walking up and down the hills and sick of riding their bikes up and down the hills.
It's a lot of work. And
they came up with the idea that maybe they would put a motor on the bicycle or something, And so William Harley started tinkering around with designs for a small engine to power his bicycle. And that's why one of the first motorcycles looks like a bicycle with an engine on it. I mean, it looks very similar to one of those old nostalgic...
The rickety ones?
Well, the nostalgic, what do they call them? The Flyer or the Beachcomber looking motorcycle, the bicycle. And here's another cool little tidbit. I mean, I was reading about this and just everything started coming together for me. Because I don't know if you've been around boats, but have you ever heard of an Evinrude motor?
No, I'm not familiar with boats, motorcycles, any of these machinery.
Because you're a video gamer?
I'm a video gamer, yeah. I'm a sports guy. You know that.
Yeah, I know. The sports podcast legend. Okay. So, no, Evinrude is a notable boat motor manufacturer. I mean, they make outboard motors. And I don't know about the rest of it. I didn't do any investigation on Evinrude, but basically, it's a notable, very well-made motor. And so Ole Evinrude was building engines for cars at the time in the early 1900s and helped William Harley design his motor for his motorized bicycle.
Huh.
And so between William Harley and Arthur Davidson and Ole Evinrude, they produced this prototype motorcycle and entered it at a state fair race there in Milwaukee. And they placed fourth. I guess this was in, I don't know, 1904-ish, somewhere around there.
So you never hear about the third guy behind the scenes. It's always Harley and Davidson, but you never hear about the third guy.
Well, there's more to it, though. He just sort of helped out in the beginning, but he didn't really stick with the endeavor.
Clearly, he's a boat guy.
He did his thing. But there's two other Davidsons involved, and I guess one was maybe a brother, and one may have been a dad. So there was a couple of different Davidsons. Anyway, in 1905, so like a couple of years later, they sold 3 of the 5 motorcycles that they made in that shed in their backyard. In fact, they took that shed and they moved it to the factory as a nostalgic,
that's awesome
thing, and they probably set up the tools and the old first motorcycle and all that in it. It'd be really interesting to go to the Harley Davidson Museum there in Milwaukee, at their factory, the first factory.
Now, how do you think they decided whose name goes first on the brand?
I think it was Harley's idea.
Okay.
And he designed the motor.
Gotcha. Yeah, that'll do it. Because usually when you're thinking of that kind of thing, I would think alphabetical order. But if you would say Davidson Harley, that just doesn't flow off the tongue like Harley Davidson does.
Well, it does. Yeah, I mean, phonetically it doesn't. Yeah. You're right. But no, I think it was Harley's idea, and he sort of brought his friend in on it, and I think Harley was the driving force on a lot of it. Even though there were like 3 Davidsons involved.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But so anyway, they sold 3 out of the 5. And then in 1906, the year after, they built a factory. I guess the parents got sick of them using the garage. And they sold 50 motorcycles. So they went from 3 to 50. And then the year after that, the year William Harley graduated from college. So he did all this while in college, studying mechanical engineering. So then he graduates college, builds a factory, and produces 150 motorcycles in 1907.
Wow.
Yeah, he was.
That's a lot.
I don't think he had a girlfriend or partied or did much anything else. Or slept.
Or ate, yeah, that's insane.
And that reminds me, I was talking to my son, and I've been trying to, over the years, help him find some passion, something he's just really itching to get up in the morning for, something he just looks forward to. Kind of like me in this podcast. I really enjoy this. But so it reminds me of that, and he's about the same age. And I was thinking, geez, I mean, if he could just find something like this to sink his teeth into, and I think he's close. I think he's close. He really loves cars.
That's awesome.
And so I was talking to him about Interstate Batteries and maybe working for that company and getting involved with their NASCAR team and
Yeah.
all that stuff. But anyway, that was a little squirrel.
That's why it's called squirrel marketing.
I guess so. Consequently, I looked. I was going to buy the website, and I looked, and there's an actual company called Squirrel Marketing.
Oh, wow.
We're not affiliated with them, but anyway. So a little history. It's a really interesting beginning. But what made Harley? What made the company successful from that?
So the thing, I think one of the main appeals of Harley is American made. And I think a lot of people nowadays treasure American made products and goods that you can find here in the States. And because Harley is that brand, they're an extension of America. They're a symbol of American freedom, essentially. And so I think that's rare. Right now, at least, that's where they're really successful.
Yeah, actually, the fact that they are a piece of Americana or American culture, that really helps out in a couple of ways. We'll talk about it in a minute. But the way they became that is interesting. So fast forward a little bit to 1914. Harley was dominating racing. They got involved with racing. They just loved the sport. They're just gearheads. They just loved tuning the bikes and running the races. And so in 1914, they made 16,000 bikes that year. And that's nothing compared to now.
Right, that probably making that a day.
But World War I was coming on. And World War I is kind of the catalyst to Harley's immense growth. I mean, they just, because the war effort, the government bought 20,000 motorcycles from Harley Davidson for transporting between bases or whatever, but on the battlefield.
So the military used motorcycles too.
The military really kicked this thing off because now you have these veterans coming back from war, really enthralled by this experience on a motorcycle, and then they want to buy one too. And so it was kind of involved, and this was before Vietnam when war wasn't cool. So you really kind of idolized these guys who would sacrifice their lives to go off and fight for our country. And so whether you agree with why we're there or not, these guys are still heroes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even Vietnam and even today, they're heroes for their self-sacrifice.
No question.
But, so that was sort of the start of it. And then in World War II, they supplied like 100,000 motorcycles to the war effort, to Allies and to our troops. And by then, they had those nice big ones, the bigger, more powerful motorcycles. And they were winning races like crazy. And but in 1920, I got ahead of myself. By 1920, though, they were the biggest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, period, which was kind of launched by us here in America. I mean, we at least we made it cool.
Now, I would hope that since they invented the product, that they would be the number one seller.
I'm just thinking. Well, there were other people. There was some stuff going on in Germany. There was some stuff going on in Japan, and so there was a lot of innovation going on simultaneously around the world with airplanes and motorcycles and all these kinds of things. But we kind of made it a thing, and Harley dominated it. And so in World War II, 100,000 motorcycles, and then again in the Korean War. So a lot of war effort stuff. It was really cool in Hollywood.
Absolutely.
So you had James Dean on his motorcycle. You had everybody cool was on a motorcycle. You had Peter Fonda, and these guys doing movies about a motorcycle gang and all this.
Now, I would never, before you had said it, I would have never associated motorcycle with the military. When I think military vehicle, I think big armored Hummer tank. I don't think small, compactable vehicle that is unprotected essentially.
Well, have you ever seen Indiana Jones movies?
A long time ago.
So you remember the Germans on their motorcycles with the little sidecars?
Yeah.
So they would shuttle their like little cabs. They would shuttle. They would take an Uber, if you will.
An Uber back in 1920.
An Uber cycle. So they would shuttle officers in the little sidecars. So they had a guy that would pick up an officer and rush him to the next base.
Yeah.
Or there was other ones, little hot shot without a sidecar, and they would take messages from one place to another. I mean, and they were flying.
Yeah.
So it was a quick way to get messages to places that didn't have any kind of communication devices, and you didn't have cell phones back then. So,
of course.
But they did have the hardwired communication. You just couldn't do that 20 miles away.
Right.
So you were, I guess, doing the Morse code or whatever, or taking documents on motorcycles.
That's interesting.
From the general to the front lines or whatever. So it was really useful. However, not sure why this happened, but in 1969, the year I was born, they were bought. Harley Davidson was bought by American Machine and Foundry, and they just about killed the company. They came in with their new ideas about slashing wages and workforce and efficiencies and.
Sounds all too familiar.
Yeah, restaurants tend to do it. You'll have a great restaurant, and then somebody will buy it, and then they'll do like portion control to the point where it's so tiny and it's horrible for people that used to like it. So Harley, man, they were stripped down, slashed the workforce. They cut corners on the building line, the procedures. They raised the prices as well. They were just trying to really strip mine this deal.
Yeah.
And take advantage of its status as being, cool. They almost went bankrupt. And in fact, the bikes had such a bad connotation in the market that they had nicknames like hardly drivable.
Oh gosh, that's cringe.
Hogley Ferguson and so the Hog name, which started out as a cool thing. There was a group of guys, they called themselves the Hog guys or something. And later on, Hog stood for the Harley Owners Group. But back then, it was pejorative. I mean, it was a negative slur. They called him a hog, like it's just going to leak all over the place. And it's even to the point where when I was a kid, probably in the early 80s, I remember thinking, I want a Honda.
Over a Harley.
Because I don't want to work on it all the time. I don't want it leaking all over the driveway.
Yeah.
And my dad even said, and he had Harleys, he loved them. His dad bought him his first one in college and loved Harleys. But he never said anything about it. He never dispelled my thoughts on it because maybe his did leak. I don't know.
So when they had that bad reputation, what improved it? What got them back to where they are now?
Well, what improved them is the exact same thing we're talking about that we haven't discussed yet, which is the competitive part between Harley and Honda. So Honda, we'll just jump over. Honda came in the 50s, and they had a little 50cc motorcycle. I don't know if you've ever seen the wheeling Elvi. These people, they dress up like Elvis, and they ride these little 50cc motorcycles. Yeah. Well, a good friend of mine is one of the wheeling Elvi. His name is Drew. He's super cool. But Harley made a comment back then in the 50s that they didn't have to worry about Honda because nobody's going to buy that little thing. And so they thought they were beyond competition. They were above it. They were past it now. Which is a bad thing to get to. If you get too confident in your industry and you think that you can't be taken out, you're wrong.
Yeah, complacency is never good, for sure.
So Honda came in, and they started making a little bit bigger motorcycles by then in the 60s and late 60s, early 70s. They had more than a 50. I think they may have had like a 125 or I'm not sure, but they didn't have any big ones at the time.
So for us,
they had a cafe racer style. They had the.
For us ignorant people, explain what the CCs mean.
It's just the size of the motor. For instance, cubic inches.
Gotcha.
50 cc's. Without looking it up, I don't know, what does it mean? Cubic centimeters?
Something like that. Okay. Gotcha.
But so 50 cc is a small motor. 600 cc's is a bigger motor. 1,000 cc's, that's a big old motor. The police cruisers probably have 1,000 cc or bigger motor.
So they can fly.
They fly. Yeah, so the little 50 cc's, it's like a little mini bike.
Gotcha.
And when I was in high school, my dad took me up to Colorado, and we rode motorcycles on the logging trails up in the mountains.
Oh, awesome.
And I had a 150, and he had a 125 Hondas, both of them, something like that. And they were cool. Small enough to maneuver, but powerful enough to get up the hill. And these were dirt bikes, but here's how Harley fixed their problem. First of all, the company, American Machine and Foundry, started to realize what they were doing wrong.
They were like,
we're really kind of screwing up here. I mean, their prices were, their sales were tanking. And so they sent their executives to tour the Honda factory. What are these guys doing that we're not doing? Why is everybody saying that they want a Honda because the quality is amazing and they don't want our motorcycles? Well, that's easy to see. So they went and visited Honda. They talked to them, and Honda and the Japanese were very accommodating. They helped them out. They gave them advice. They showed them things that they could do to improve.
Now, why would Honda do that?
I think it's an honor thing.
Huh.
I think it's an old traditional honor thing where they were just gracious. They were competitive, but at the same time, it's for the good of the art, for the good of the industry. They helped them out.
Because like in other industries, let's say for instance tech, Apple ain't helping Samsung or giving them any trade secrets.
Probably not.
Probably
not. No.
So that's a rare thing.
Yeah, but back then maybe not so much. I mean, you would find people helping each other, and they were competitors, and so then they would work together on something, and then afterwards they would go back to being competitors. Just like people used to be able to get in a fist fight and not hold a grudge.
Yeah.
Or debate and then still be friends.
Yeah. That used to be a thing.
It used to be a thing. It's still a thing with me and my friends, but For a lot of people, it's more narcissistic than it used to be, and I think back then it was a lot more about helping each other, and there was still cutthroat and there was still jerks out there. I mean, but the Honda people were gracious, and typically the Japanese are. They seem to be.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're not talking about the generals and stuff, but we're talking about regular people. I remember I took judo as a kid, and the judo instructor, super gracious, super generous, patient, really kind person. And I think that a lot of the Japanese are like that. But anyway, so they brought that stuff back. They brought their tolerance. There's a certain tolerance when you do manufacturing, and it has to do with the thousandth of an inch or whatever. So they tightened their tolerances, and an interesting thing happened. Harley started to give the people on their line, on their production line, more ownership of their job. So they gave them incentives on quality. And it was really interesting what happened, because they took more ownership of it. They took more pride in it. They had their production stamp. They were proud of their production stamp, and so they were proud that this motorcycle came from them.
Yeah.
Well, they started to institute that as a thing, as part of the company culture, and their quality went up. And
I think that's a lesson that could be learned from, for any company is rewarding people for good work.
well, this is a common thread when we talk about these other companies, because some of the most innovative companies that we're going to talk about began to treat their workforce with more respect, more rewards, stock ownership in the company, or a share of profit.
You're usually going to get more out of your workforce when you're doing those kind of things.
Yeah, you share it. If you're going to share in the harvest with your workforce as a bonus structure or whatever, and it's transparent where you can see, here's where if we do really well as a group, we're all going to make more for Christmas or whatever, something. It's always beneficial for that. But so Harley, they really came back, and they came back with a vengeance. They before the American Machine and Foundry sold the company, they produced something called the Liberty Edition in 1977, which was sort of an American. It was a tribute, and so their 1977 model was really a big seller, and but then they tried to follow it up with a Confederate edition.
Oof.
With all the Confederate colors and flag and all that stuff. It was pretty controversial even back then, in the late 70s. But anyway, so early 80s, it was bought by some investors, and they really these were Harley lovers. These guys who bought it, they just loved the brand, and they're the ones who created the Harley Owners Group. And they started these rallies, and now you find these motorcycle rallies with 100,000 people or more.
Yeah, they're crazy big.
It's huge, and in fact, what we're going to talk about here in just a second, that's what got Harley through the problem with Honda. So early on, Honda helped them fix their quality problem, but Honda kept going and kept learning from Harley how to appeal to more American buyers.
Yeah. So it really was a mutually beneficial relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. But so Honda started making bigger and bigger motorcycles, great quality, They started making them that looked the part. They made like I mentioned, the cafe racer. They entered the races, and they were really starting to be a major competitor, and they started coming into the bigger motorcycle industry, that segment of the market. And Harley had a big problem with it. And, it's funny how you underestimate your competitor, and then they come around and bite you.
Yep.
But it's all friendly competition, really. That there was no underhandedness about it. They were just competing with the best they could offer.
And I guess, like I said earlier, that's a virtue that just doesn't really exist very often in the business world.
No, not at all. I mean, it's there's a lot of cutthroat stuff going on. But so what happened with Harley that we're talking about now is that really the quality problems really hurt them, and they continued to have some quality issues. But what's funny is they came out the other side because of not only their how they treated their employees and how the employees had some ownership going on of their position. They had some skin in the game there. But also the Harley Owners Group carried with it some revenue. So you had the Harley gear, and you had the membership, and you had these other things that really kind of helped stabilize the problem that Harley had in their revenue.
So one thing I kind of wanted to get into was Harley is now bigger than just a motorcycle brand. Harley is like a fashion statement. It's a t-shirt brand. I think at one point they had restaurants you could even go into and eat at. I mean, Harley became this entire corporation, this entire brand that is, synonymous with America.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, the only reason why they had a big problem, and I guess this was, I don't have the timeline on it, but it was the 80s. It was in the 80s. And so they failed to keep looking inward, right? Remember when we talked about the SWOT analysis,
Yeah.
the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? That's not something you do once when you're forming your company. That's something you do all the time. And
At least once a year.
well, yeah. But Harley didn't do it at all. I mean, it completely ignored their weaknesses and their threats. And they actually felt, like a lot of people, a lot of company owners, that if you just focus on your strengths and your opportunities, you don't have to worry about your weaknesses and your threats. And that's short-sighted. There's people who actually think that. But if you look at your weaknesses, you can work on them and turn them into strengths.
Yeah.
If you look at your threats, you can mitigate the issue, prevent them from being a threat, and find something involved in it that becomes an opportunity. So you're always trying to take your weaknesses and turn them into strengths, and you're always trying to take your threats and turn them into opportunities. And so without looking at or analyzing their weaknesses, so they had a weakness of quality, and they learned a little bit from it, and they started to help fix that. But they had a threat, which was Honda, and they completely looked the other way. They were like, okay, these guys are in here. Nobody's going to buy that stupid little motorcycle. Well, they weren't stupid little motorcycles forever.
Turned out that, yeah.
They started making bigger ones and nicer ones and the more appealing designs and all of it, and still had the quality, right? And probably without the tariffs and everything, cheaper. And eventually they were cheaper. There was a problem with tariffs and everything, but really, Harley started to become sort of a celebrity. Mm-hmm. And I remember when, you couldn't really afford one. I mean, back when my dad had one, you could, and they were reasonably priced. But then in the late 60s, early 70s, into the 80s, they got kind of expensive. It was like a rich person's toy.
So it sounds like they went through this period of great prosperity, and then when they were bought out, it sort of went downhill from there. And now in the last 20 years or so, it feels like they've kind of reverted back to what they were when they first started.
Well, it seems like they've got some really smart people at the helm now, and they realize that we're an ever-changing world. And in fact, they this started, I guess, it was in the late 80s or so. But I wanted to talk about this piece where Harley, when Honda started to really compete with them, Harley started looking at sending their motorcycles to Asia, to China, and trying to compete in that market. And so they spent a lot of money on it. And this was one of the problems that I'm talking about with them financially. Not only did they have a problem with Honda being a major competitor, and they didn't plan for it, but they also decided to sort of attack back and try to break into the Chinese market. The only problem is they didn't do their research very well. First of all, the Chinese didn't want the big motorcycles. They were too heavy.
No one of the smaller ones.
And they needed to be maneuverable for the roads and for the job. The job didn't require a big honking motorcycle.
Right.
But also, they had no idea the Chinese government required the destruction of motorcycles after 11 years. So, yeah.
The destruction.
Right.
Of motorcycles.
Yeah, there's no classics in China. You don't have a classic car. You don't have a classic motorcycle.
That's crazy.
They destroy and recycle, and so therefore they don't have any junkers or whatever. But they also don't have any nostalgic pieces.
Yeah, that's wild.
11 years, motorcycles destroyed, crushed, whatever. And so Harley had no idea, and so they had to make lighter, smaller, cheaper motorcycles for that market because people weren't going to spend a whole lot of money knowing that, first of all, they may be a long way from a shop to fix it.
Right.
So the quality has to be there. But it has to be small enough to maneuver and it won't crush somebody's leg. But then cheap enough that within 11 years they got their usefulness out of it, and it wasn't so much more expensive than the ones they normally bought that it made sense. Well, they spent a lot of money on that endeavor, and so
without the research,
right? But now they're back. They're back because, like I said, they have smart people at the helm, and they planned ahead for the fact that there's always change going on. They probably do an ongoing analysis internally now, and they look at the market. They look at where we're headed. They look at the fact that a lot of people don't have tons of money to buy a motorcycle, so they make it more affordable. Maybe some financing plans that are cheap, maybe some cheap interest financing.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. So I think they've come full circle, and now they are an American motorcycle legend.
That's a great American story of how even you start a business and it's successful, and then it goes through a dip. There's always going to be peaks and valleys, but if you get the right people in charge and you do the right things, there's no reason why you can't be successful.
There's no reason why you can't be successful if you have the right model, you have the right product, your product's not obsolete. You always got to look and make sure that you're not in the VHS business. You're not renting videotapes.
You're not rolling well behind the times.
Exactly. But then competitive analysis. Look at your competitors. Look at what people like. Do a survey. Give some stuff away. Get feedback. All this stuff matters. And if you're in the service industry, find out what people like. Find out from your clients what they liked best about working with you. And if you take a look at your weaknesses through either surveys or people who will be honest with you about your presentation, maybe you were a little short and abrasive, maybe whatever. Maybe they don't like your beard. I don't know. You gotta look at what people like and don't like about you or your service, and you gotta look at your competitors and see how they're doing it. But that's all the time we've got. So
that was a good one.
Yeah, Harley. So next time we're going to talk about either Apple versus Samsung, Nokia, Motorola, etc., or we're going to talk about Fujitsu, who many of you probably don't have a clue why or how they're a powerhouse in the industry right now.
Sounds good to me.
All right. Till next time.
See ya.